like energy. What's the price of electricity going to be 15 months from now or 15 weeks from now? It doesn't make any sense. There's no need for counterparties to make those kind of trades. But he started aggressively lobbying the woman who was the head of the federal agency that regulated this. Her name was Wendy Graham, to deregulate this stuff. Wendy Graham then, in 1996, during the Clinton administration, deregulated took a very large deregulatory step and allowed energy to be traded as a commodity.
Phil Graham's wife.
Wendy was the wife of Phil Graham, the senator from Texas. We're going to get to Phil in a second. And she then left the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and went to become a member of the board of directors of Enron. This wasn't enough for Phil. He still wanted to be able to buy a bank, and he still wanted that bank to be able to now trade in those commodities. He wanted to be able to put the money, be able to stash the money away from the bankers who were figuring out what he was up to. And he also wanted to be able to be sure that he could gamble with that money, which meant that this separation, this wall of separation that the Glass-Steagall Act from 1933 put in place between commercial banks and investment banks, that had to be broken down. So it could all be one bank, and you had to reduce the regulations about who could own a bank so that Ken could own a bank. And also, wouldn't it be fun if we could deregulate the actual trading of commodities themselves? I mean, radically deregulate them. So that it didn't even have to be primary commodities with primary counterparties. So it could be what are called secondary and tertiary, and I forget the word for beyond three, commodity exchanges. And I'll explain that in just a second. So Phil Graham in 1999 and 2000 introduced two pieces of legislation that did exactly what Ken Lay wanted. The first was the Graham-Leach-Bliley bill, which broke down Glass-Steagall, put an end to that and made it possible for Ken Lay to buy his own bank and start gambling inside his own bank inside Enron. The second is called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And what it said was, you didn't have to be a counterparty. You didn't have to be willing to take delivery on that wheat in order to bet on that wheat. And you could even bet on bets about the wheat. And in fact, it didn't even have to be wheat. Well, that decision was already made by Wendy Graham back in '96. So what happened was in 2000, it's just 13 years ago. In 2000, and by the way, this is not that different from what was happening between 1921 and 1929. I told you, we do 60 years of figuring it out, and then actually the quote from Arnold Toynbee is, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable, right? 60 years on, when Phil Graham was proposing in 1999 on the floor of the Senate that we do away with Glass-Steagall, his principal argument was, we had never had more than 15 years without a banking panic up until 1933, and then we put into Glass-Steagall, and we haven't had a single banking panic in the 60 years since then. It's working so well, it's time to let go of it. We don't need it anymore. We figured this one out. Now, if Phil Graham had tried to say that in 1940, he would have been laughed off the Senate floor, because there would have been a bunch of senators who were alive in the 1920s, and they would have said, what the hell are you saying? Are you serious? If he tried that in the 50s, he would have been laughed at in the 60s, in the 70s, even in the 80s. But by 1999, maybe Robert Byrd was saying it, but he was talking like, "Are you crazy, Phil? You can't do that!" And people were saying, "Shut up, Grandpa!" And it was like, this is the thing. It's when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. When the last man who remembers the horrors of the stupid economic mistakes we made last time is no longer around to speak up, or if he is, he's not taken seriously, and he or she, then the next disaster becomes inevitable. And that's why we see these 80-year cycles. 80 years ago was the Great Depression of 1929. 80 years before that was the Great Depression of 1857. 80 years before that was the Great Depression of 1770. And if you look at the Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe, they take it all the way back to the 14th century. So, it's basically 60 years, and then we get stupid, and then 20 years of just general insanity, and then it just crashes. So Phil Graham passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, and what happened was companies started doing stuff like this, and this was so cool. They didn't do it so much with real commodities, because with real commodities you could actually see the stuff, right? How much corn is there? Oh, there's a corn satellite. You can see it. You can see, where's the pork bellies? They're right there. There's physical. But with mortgages, they're magic, right? Nobody can see mortgages. You don't drive down the street and have everybody has a sign in front of their house about how much of a mortgage they have on their house or how underwater they're at. You know, this is like magic stuff. Only the bankers know. So they started taking mortgages and bundling them together and selling these bundles as securities, saying here's a commodity. It's a bunch of mortgages. And then they went to AIG and other big insurance companies and said, we'd like to get insurance that this commodity, this bunch of mortgages will not collapse. So AIG wrote an insurance policy, which is basically a bet. You know, when you buy life insurance, Dick Gregory used to tell this joke. I thought it was hysterical. He said, you know, let me get this straight. I'm giving money to you, the insurance company, and on the premise that if I die, you're going to pay, and I'm hoping that you lose, or I'm hoping that I lose. I lose the bet, right? This makes no sense. But still, so they did this insurance. AIG did the insurance. Then a bunch of guys, and mostly operating out of townhouses in Manhattan. I mean, the New York Times did a really interesting story about this about a year ago. It was in the Sunday paper, one of these really long, 12-page stories about these 8 guys who were sitting in this townhouse, and every week they'd get together and they trade billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of tertiary and forward commodities. So they'd say, okay, well, we got $1 million worth of mortgages, or $1 million worth of mortgages. We'll buy $10 million worth of insurance on that, and then somebody else would come along and say, I'll buy a $100 million bet, insurance policy bet. If that $10 million bet isn't going to go bad, or is going to go bad, take your choice. There would be people on both sides. So all of a sudden that $10 million becomes a $100 million bet. 2 parties, it's $200 million worth of betting. And somebody comes along and says, $100 million? I'll bet $1 billion that it's not going to go bad. And somebody else will bet $1 billion that it will go bad, because you got to have 2 parties for the bet, right? $1 billion, I'll bet $10 billion. $10 billion, I'll bet $100 billion. 100, I'll bet 1,000, I'll bet $1 trillion. And it's all going back down to this original $1 million worth of mortgages, which has actual value, and because that value is derived from those mortgages and seeps into these bets are called derivatives. They derive their value from the underlying original commodity. In 1999, when Phil Gramm legalized this, the amount of bets on bets on bets on bets on bets was pretty insignificant. It really didn't move the meter in the American banking system. It was happening, but it was not a big deal. And it was happening mostly in the insurance industry. In 2008, according to the Bank of International Settlements, the amount of derivatives being traded worldwide, and the United States was the epicenter of this, but it was happening out of the London and Frankfurt offices big time, and Hong Kong as well. Actually, before I give you this number, let me give you a reference number. The gross domestic product of the United States, all business activity, all buying, all selling, all salaries, all manufacturing, all government spending, everything, all combined is $15 trillion a year. The GDP of the entire planet, Europe, Russia, South America, Africa, every place, every continent on Earth, Australia, $65 trillion. Okay, got that in your head? $65 trillion is the GDP of the entire planet. According to the Bank of International Settlements, the number of counterparty derivatives being traded in 2008 was over $800 trillion. That's just total funny money, right? This was just like the stock market in 1929. It was funny money. It was totally nutso. And when it crashed in 2008, it went down to around $400 or $500 trillion, but it's back up to about $700 trillion right now. And this represents no value whatsoever. There's no, Adam Smith would look at this and go, where's the damn axe handle, right? There's no value here. This is just people moving money around. And this is why these banksters in New York are able to make $2 billion a year, $3 billion a year. Because if you're trading $1 trillion worth of derivatives and you're just skimming 0.25% off every trade, pretty soon you're making $1 billion a year. And these guys are trading hundreds of trillions of dollars. So we have, in ecosystems that are broad and diverse are stable and strong. Forests, jungles, they can withstand drought, they can withstand rain. Ecosystems that are monoculture, a single wheat crop that's all one DNA, one type of wheat, is not stable and strong, it's vulnerable. Our economy now, I think I mentioned before, there's not a single industry, major industry in the United States that's not owned by, over 80% of which is not owned by fewer than 5 corporations, whether it's the media, whether it's entertainment, whether it's travel, whether it's food. I mean, you pick it, 5 corporations. Powell's is one of the great exceptions to that. Which is one of the reasons why this is such an important institution. It's one of the mighty remnants of when America was great. So what we have now is this paper moon economy. It crashed in 2008, and Obama had this 13-week window until Scott Brown was sworn in to replace Mitt Romney. He had 13 weeks where he had a filibuster-proof Senate. And he had, the original conspiracy. The night that he was inaugurated, a bunch of Republicans got together at the Caucus Room restaurant and swore basically a blood oath that they would do everything they could to block anything he did, period. Even if they agreed with it, they would block it. Because they wanted to destroy his presidency, have a failed presidency. But he had this 13-week window, and during that window, he was able to get that stimulus passed. It wasn't anywhere near big enough or good enough, but it was enough to stop the bleeding. We went from losing 800,000 jobs a month to making a few thousand jobs a month, in some cases over 100,000 jobs a month. Our economy has not come back to where it was. In 1980, the year that Jimmy Carter was running against Ronald Reagan, unemployment was 3.8%. Right? People go, oh, that Carter administration, that really sucked. Jimmy Carter didn't know how to run a damn economy. 3.8% unemployment? Are you serious? I mean, had Reagan's campaign not cut a deal with Iran to hold the hostages, but don't get me started on that. Read, those of you who are curious about that, the guy who was president of Iran in 1980, who tried to free the hostages, he ran in the summer of 1980 on the platform of I'm going to free the hostages, and won 76% of the vote. Bonnie Sauter wrote an op-ed this March in Christian Science Monitor, in which he said, when I tried to free the hostages in September of 1980, and I went to the Ayatollahs and said, let's let them go, they said, no, we cut a deal with the Bush administration, or with the Reagan campaign, excuse me, and we are already taking delivery of tires via Israel for our spare parts. But anyway, so we've got this economy that is just, it fell apart in 2008. It's being held together with baling wire and bubble gum. I know that during the Bush years, in 2006, 2007, they saw this crash happening, and they did everything they could to make it happen the day after the election. So if a Democrat was elected, they could say, see? And if a Democrat wasn't elected, they could say, oh, we'll save the world. And they had a plan for either one. Well, it didn't work out, because the crash happened in early 2008, the stock market crash, and they couldn't do anything about it. And you had, Tim Geithner out there, or what was his name, Lloyd, whoever the guy was, Trembling, the Secretary of Treasury, former president of Goldman Sachs, and Frank Holston. Thank you very much. And I'm of the opinion that the Obama administration is doing the same thing. It's not because they're nasty people, it's because they're politicians, and this is what you do. You don't want the great crash to happen while in the middle of your presidency, right? And so, quantitative, in fact, Financial Times ran a piece about this day before yesterday, about how, the market is not responding to actual economic activity any longer. It's responding to Fed meetings. Because the Fed is buying $85 billion a year worth of half of its T-bills, and the other half is toxic assets, also known as derivatives, from the banks, right? Slowly pulling this stuff out of the marketplace. But $80 billion a month is not going to make a dent in $700 trillion worth of derivatives. So this thing is going to pop. So that's the bad news. The good news is that when you look at these cycles in the past, every time the economy has popped, and it has always largely popped for the exact same reasons. I lay it out in the book. People start speculating that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Lewis Powell, Russell Kirk, those guys, they thought they were just making a more stable and healthier America, a stronger America. You know, we would become progressive eventually, but it'll take just a little longer. But what happened was they cracked open the door for the predators and the sociopaths to come in, the Ken Lays of the world. And they came in and they basically bought the politicians and took over the system, and they hollowed it out, and now we got this canvas moon that's our economy. And that's the bad news. The good news is that every time one of these crashes happens, it becomes that moment in time when, for the average person who hasn't been paying attention to politics and hasn't been paying attention to economics, suddenly, to paraphrase Leonard Cohen, you know, reality cracks open and the light comes out. You know? It's like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, now I get it. You know, now I know who these people are and what they do. Now I know why they call them banksters, right? And they throw the bombs out, and we have a progressive revolution, which I've referred to twice already. I don't need to recite the whole thing again. And so, in summary, we are in the middle of the Great Depression of our era. The Great Depression in the 1930s, the phrase Great Depression was coined in the 1940s. It was referred to, if you go back and read or listen to FDR's speeches, he referred to this present crisis, these difficult times, these challenging times, this recession, same way we do now. In the 40s, they looked back and they said, that was a hell of a lot worse than, you know, that was the Great Depression. We will someday refer to this as the Great Depression right now. And it's going to have to crack, and out of that is going to come, I think, so much progressive change that America can become, once again, this extraordinary country that it was. And we can have, and we can go back to the Jetsons. You know, I mean, remember after in the '60s, Time magazine said, you know, everybody's going to make $100,000 a year. Remember the Jetsons? George Jetson, every hour or so, he'd stand up and push the button. It's basically sprockets. That was his job. And Jane could go, charge on her charge account. The single income. We can do that again. We don't have to call a Swedish economist to tell us how to do it. It's like, you know, we have done this in America. We know how to do these things. So the two things that we have to do to get ready for this, beyond your personal getting ready for it, which varies so wildly from person to person that I'm reluctant to generalize. And I'm not an investment advisor in any case. But the two things that we have to do to get ready for this are, number one, engage in the political process. In 1933, the United States was hit by the Great Depression, but so was Italy, so was France, or excuse me, so was Spain, and so was Germany. Italy had Mussolini, Spain had Franco, Germany had Hitler, we had FDR. Right now, the fastest growing political party in Greece is the Nazi Party.
Oh, no.
I mean, serious, bad political times produce opportunities. There's a space there, there's a crack there. People will step into those cracks. We need to get engaged. Thank God FDR was our president. And I'd say right now, thank God Barack Obama's our president if this crash happens on his presidency, and not John McCain. Can you imagine?
Oh yeah,
So number one, show up at your local Democratic Party, your Green Party, your Republican Party if you're inclined. We need more people like my dad, you know, Eisenhower Republicans, people of goodwill inside the Republican Party. Inside, try and take over the Libertarian Party if necessary. Hey Marcia, how are you? My friend Marcia Myers, she's got some cool stuff to pass out, so be sure to check her out and talk with her after you're done. So, number one, get involved in, this is an inside-outside strategy. Get inside, get involved inside. And number two, get involved outside. Get involved with organizations like the things that Marcia's doing. MoveToAmend.org, ProgressiveDemocratsOfAmerica.org, PDAmerica.org, MoveOn.org if you like the more conventional. There's some that are very unconventional. Some of the stuff that the Occupy movement has spun off. There's some really great stuff out there. There's so many opportunities. You know, wherever your heart, you'll know. When you get close to it, you'll know this is the place for me. And then just throw everything you have into that, because in the next couple of years, we're going to have this opportunity. And we need to be moving this opportunity in that FDR direction, not that Mussolini direction. And frankly, I think we will. The history of America indicates that we always do. Although, you know, just like the Nazis are rising really fast in Greece, you got some elements within the Tea Party doing the same thing here in the United States. So, bottom line, we have to be involved, and that means you and me. In other words, tag your